Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepy Facts Show, the place where you can drift off gently while learning something new. Tonight, we'll be exploring fascinating facts about William James Sidis. As you settle in, feel free to let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always enjoy seeing how far these quiet conversations travel. And if you'd like to support the show, you can find those details in the description. But for now, just get comfortable and we'll ease into tonight's topic. William James Sidis was born on April 1st, 1898 in New York City. From the very beginning, he was raised in an environment that revolved around education and intellectual development. His parents believed strongly that a child's mind could be cultivated with careful guidance and stimulation. Within a few years, Sidis would become known across the United States as one of the most extraordinary child prodigies ever recorded. Sidis's parents, Boris and Sarah Sidis, were immigrants from what is now Ukraine. Both were highly educated and deeply interested in psychology, education, and human development. They believed that children possessed enormous untapped intellectual potential if raised in the right environment. Their experimental approach to parenting would play a major role in shaping William's unusual childhood. Boris Sidis, William's father, was a respected psychologist who taught at Harvard University. He wrote extensively about psychology, hypnotism, and the development of intelligence. Boris believed that traditional schooling often suppressed a child's natural curiosity and creativity. As a result, he developed unconventional teaching methods that he used with his own son. William's mother, Sarah Mandelbaum Sidis, was also highly accomplished. She was among the earliest women in the United States to earn a medical degree. At a time when female physicians were still extremely rare, her academic achievements were remarkable. She actively participated in her son's early education and supported the intense intellectual environment at home. From infancy, William Sidis grew up surrounded by books, languages, and academic discussions. His parents treated learning almost like a game, constantly introducing him to new concepts. They believed that stimulating his mind early would help unlock his intellectual potential. As a result, William began developing advanced cognitive abilities at a very young age. According to accounts from his parents, Sidis began recognizing letters of the alphabet when he was only 6 months old. While such claims are difficult to verify today, they contributed to the legend surrounding his childhood abilities. His parents documented many of these early achievements in psychological writings. These reports helped create the public image of Sidis as an unprecedented intellectual prodigy. By the age of 18 months, Sidis reportedly demonstrated the ability to read newspapers such as the New York Times. This astonishing claim attracted widespread attention in academic and media circles. Whether completely accurate or somewhat exaggerated, it still illustrates the extraordinary expectations placed upon him. Even as a toddler, Sidis was already becoming a subject of fascination. At 2 years old, Sidis was said to be using a typewriter to compose simple letters. His parents encouraged him to explore written language in many forms. Typing allowed him to express thoughts that may have been difficult to write by hand at such a young age. This early exposure to technology was unusual for children of the early 20th century. By the time he reached 3 years old, Sidis had begun studying Latin. Learning classical languages at such an early age was extremely rare, even among gifted children. His parents believed that studying structured languages would sharpen his reasoning skills. This early introduction to Latin opened the door for him to explore many other languages as he grew older. At 4 years old, Sidis reportedly began reading works of classical Greek literature. One example often mentioned is Homer's Iliad, which he allegedly read in its original Greek form. Stories like this helped cement his reputation as a prodigy with extraordinary linguistic abilities. Whether the accounts were perfectly accurate or somewhat embellished, they contributed greatly to his early fame. By the age of 6, Sidis was said to know several languages, including English, Latin, Greek, French, German, Russian, Hebrew, and Turkish. Language learning fascinated him throughout his life. His early exposure to multiple linguistic systems allowed him to grasp grammar and vocabulary quickly. As a result, language became one of his most impressive intellectual talents. During his childhood, Sidis invented his own artificial language called Vindergood. Like real languages, it included grammar rules, verb structures, and vocabulary. Creating an entire language demonstrated a remarkable understanding of linguistic systems. It also showed that Sidis was not just memorizing information, but actively experimenting with complex ideas. Many accounts claim Sidis had an IQ between 250 and 300, which would make him one of the most intelligent people ever measured. However, modern psychologists caution that these estimates are unreliable. Intelligence testing was still developing during Sidis's childhood, and such extreme scores are difficult to verify. Even so, his abilities were clearly far beyond those of most children his age. At 8 years old, Sidis successfully passed entrance examinations for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Despite his remarkable performance, the school refused to admit him because he was simply too young. This decision reflected concerns about his emotional and social development. For the moment, his academic ambitions had to wait. In 1909, Sidis entered Harvard University at the age of 11. This made him one of the youngest students ever admitted to the institution. His enrollment quickly became a national news story. Newspapers across the country reported on the tiny boy attending lectures alongside adult students. The media quickly turned Sidis into a public spectacle. Journalists were fascinated by the idea of a boy genius attending Harvard. Articles described his intelligence, habits, and daily routine in great detail. Unfortunately, this intense attention would follow him for much of his life. The constant publicity created enormous pressure for Sidis as a child. Reporters and educators alike predicted that he would grow up to become one of the greatest scientists or mathematicians in history. Such expectations would have been overwhelming for almost anyone. For Sidis, the burden of fame began long before he reached adulthood. In 1910, at just 11 years old, Sidis delivered a lecture to the Harvard Mathematical Club. The subject of the lecture was four-dimensional geometry, a highly abstract mathematical concept. Many of the attendees were experienced mathematicians and professors. They were astonished that such a young student could discuss such complex ideas. The lecture on four-dimensional bodies impressed many scholars at Harvard. Some mathematicians considered it a remarkable demonstration of theoretical thinking. For the young Sidis, however, it was simply another academic challenge. Despite the praise he received, he remained a quiet and somewhat shy student. Sidis graduated from Harvard University in 1914 at the age of 16. This achievement confirmed his reputation as one of the most academically gifted individuals of his time. However, graduation also marked the end of the most public phase of his life. The years that followed would take a very different direction than many people expected. Although Sidis had graduated from Harvard at such a young age, he did not feel triumphant about the accomplishment. Instead, he began to grow increasingly frustrated with the expectations placed upon him. Newspapers and professors alike predicted he would revolutionize mathematics or science. Sidis himself seemed far less interested in becoming a public intellectual. Shortly after graduating, Sidis accepted a teaching position at the Rice Institute in Houston, Texas, which is now known as Rice University. This institute hoped that hiring such a famous prodigy would attract attention to the young school. Sidis was hired to teach mathematics and geometry. However, the experience would prove deeply uncomfortable for him. When Sidis began teaching at Rice, he was only 17 years old. Many of his students were older than he was, which created an unusual classroom dynamic. Some students reportedly struggled to take such a young instructor seriously. For Sidis, the social pressure of teaching proved far more difficult than the mathematics itself. Despite his extraordinary intelligence, Sidis was shy and somewhat socially awkward. Standing in front of a classroom and lecturing was stressful for him. Reports from the time suggest that he sometimes struggled to maintain authority in the classroom. teaching quickly became something he dreaded rather than enjoyed. Within less than a year, Sidis resigned from his position at Rice Institute. The experience convinced him that an academic career might not suit him. He disliked the attention that came with being known as a former prodigy. After leaving Texas, he returned to the northeastern United States. Sidis attempted to continue his education by enrolling at Harvard Law School in 1916. Law offered a very different intellectual path compared to mathematics. Perhaps he hoped the new field would allow him to start fresh without the same expectations. For a time, it seemed he might pursue a legal career. However, Sidis soon became disillusioned with law school as well. The intense academic environment reminded him of the pressure he had experienced at Harvard as a child. He reportedly told classmates that he disliked the competitive nature of legal training. Before completing his degree, he decided to leave the program. By the end of the 1910s, Sidis had become increasingly determined to live outside the spotlight. The constant media attention surrounding his early life had become exhausting. He longed for a quiet life where his intelligence was not the center of public curiosity. This desire would shape many of his later choices. During this period, Sidis also became politically active. The early 20th century was a time of intense social debate in the United States. Labor movements, socialism, and anti-war activism were becoming increasingly visible. Like many young intellectuals of the time, Sidis began exploring radical political ideas. Sidis expressed sympathy for socialist political movements that criticized economic inequality. These ideas were especially appealing during an era when industrialization had created stark wealth disparities. Many intellectuals believed socialism offered a fairer system for society. Sidis became involved in political discussions and demonstrations connected to these ideas. He was also strongly opposed to World War I. The conflict had deeply divided American society. Some citizens supported intervention, while others believed the war was unnecessary and destructive. Sidis joined those who publicly criticized the war effort. In 1919, Sidis participated in a May Day socialist demonstration in Boston. May Day protests at the time often focused on labor rights and political reform. The demonstration took place during a period of heightened political tension in the United States. Authorities were especially wary of socialist gatherings following the Russian Revolution. During the protest, Sidis was arrested along with many other demonstrators. Police accused the protesters of causing disorder and resisting arrest. For Sidis, the arrest became another moment when public attention suddenly returned to his life. Newspapers once again began writing about the former child prodigy. A court sentenced Sidis to 18 months in prison for his role in the demonstration. The sentence was surprisingly severe compared to some others involved in the protest. The case attracted national attention because of Sidis's earlier fame. Many observers were shocked that the once celebrated genius now faced imprisonment. Sidis's parents intervened before he was sent to prison. Instead of serving the sentence, they arranged for him to stay in a private sanatorium. These institutions were often used at the time for rest, psychological treatment, or quiet rehabilitation. The goal was to keep him away from political activism and public controversy. During his time in the sanatorium, Sidis lived under strict supervision. His parents hoped the environment would help him regain stability and distance himself from radical politics. The experience was deeply controlled and isolating. For Sidis, it reinforced his desire to escape public attention altogether. After leaving the sanatorium, Sidis attempted to disappear from the public eye. He moved frequently between cities and avoided people who might recognize him. This was not easy because newspapers had made his face famous across the country. Nevertheless, he tried to rebuild his life quietly. One method Sidis used to avoid recognition was working under assumed names. Using pseudonyms allowed him to apply for jobs without revealing his famous past. He hoped employers would judge him based on his work rather than his childhood reputation. This strategy helped him maintain a low profile. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Sidis worked a series of ordinary jobs. These included clerical work, bookkeeping, and other modest positions. Many people found it surprising that a former Harvard prodigy chose such simple employment. For Sidis, however, these jobs offered peace and anonymity. Sidis repeatedly expressed that he preferred a quiet life over intellectual fame. In rare interviews, he stated that the attention he received as a child had been overwhelming. Working in ordinary positions allowed him to live life without constant scrutiny. To him, privacy was far more valuable than recognition. Although Sidis avoided academic fame, he never stopped thinking deeply about intellectual subjects. Instead of publishing widely recognized research, he pursued topics that simply interested him personally. These interests often fell outside traditional academic fields. In many ways, he continued living as a private scholar. One of Sidis's most unusual lifelong passions was the study of transportation systems, particularly streetcars. At the time, American cities relied heavily on electric trolley networks. Sidis found the patterns and logistics of these systems fascinating. He spent years carefully observing routes, transfers, and schedules. Sidis began collecting streetcar transfer tickets, which passengers used when switching lanes during a journey. Many people considered these tickets disposable scraps of paper. To Sidis, however, they represented small pieces of urban history. Over time, he built a surprisingly detailed collection. His fascination with streetcars eventually led him to write about them in remarkable detail. He studied how cities designed their transit systems and how passengers moved through them. These writings reflected the same analytical mind that had once studied higher mathematics, yet they focused on a subject most scholars would have ignored. One of Sidis's most unusual books was titled The Animate and the Inanimate. In his work, he explored ideas about cosmology and the nature of the universe. The book proposed unconventional theories about how matter and energy behaved over extremely long periods of time. Although the ideas were not widely accepted, the book demonstrated his continued intellectual curiosity. Sidis suggested that the universe might experience cycles where entropy could reverse direction. In other words, he speculated that parts of the universe might move toward increasing order instead of disorder. These ideas were far outside mainstream physics at the time. Even so, they showed his willingness to think creatively about scientific questions. Because Sidis wanted to avoid attention, he often published his writings under pseudonyms. Using a false name allowed him to explore ideas without journalists recognizing him. It also helped him maintain the private life he valued so deeply. One of the pseudonyms Sidis used was Frank Volupa. Sidis wrote numerous manuscripts throughout his life that were never widely published. Some were personal studies, while others were more formal works. Because he avoided publicity, many of these writings remained obscure. Only later would researchers begin rediscovering them. Many of his writings explored unusual historical topics. Sidis was particularly interested in the history of early American societies and indigenous cultures. He believed that many important historical narratives had been overlooked. His research attempted to bring attention to these forgotten stories. He also studied the early political structures of indigenous communities. Sidis believed that some Native American societies had developed forms of democratic governance long before European settlers arrived. These ideas challenged the historical assumptions common during his lifetime. Whether accurate or not, they showed his interest in re-examining accepted narratives. Sidis never married during his lifetime. Some biographers suggest that he preferred independence and privacy. Others believe that the intense attention he experienced in childhood made close relationships difficult. Whatever the reason, he remained largely solitary throughout adulthood. He also had relatively few close friendships. Sidis often moved from city to city, which made long-term connections harder to maintain. Those who did know him sometimes described him as quietly humorous. Beneath his reserved demeanor, he still possessed a lively and curious mind. Despite his efforts to stay hidden, journalists occasionally tracked him down. Stories about the former boy genius still attracted readers. Reporters often portrayed his quiet life as a mysterious or tragic decline. For Sidis, these articles were deeply frustrating because they misunderstood the life he had chosen. Journalists frequently suggested that the once famous prodigy had failed to achieve the greatness predicted in his youth. These stories focused heavily on the contrast between his early fame and his quiet, ordinary jobs. However, they rarely considered that Sidis may have deliberately chosen this quiet life. Sidis strongly resented the idea that he had wasted his talents. From his perspective, The problem was not a lack of ability, but the overwhelming expectations placed upon him as a child. He believed the constant attention had robbed him of the freedom to live normally. For Sidis, intellectual achievement meant little if it came with a loss of privacy. In 1937, Sidis became the center of public attention once again when the New Yorker magazine published an article about him. The article described his quiet lifestyle and modest employment years after his childhood fame had faded. It portrayed him as a lonely figure living far from the promise of his early brilliance. In response, Sidis filed a lawsuit against the New Yorker for invasion of privacy. He argued that the magazine had no right to publish details about his personal life without permission. The case quickly attracted national interest because it involved questions about media freedom and personal privacy. For Sidis, the lawsuit was an attempt to regain control over his own story. The legal battle became an important early case in American privacy law. Courts had to consider whether a person who had once been famous could still claim the right to live privately. Sidis argued that his childhood fame should not justify continued public scrutiny decades later. Ultimately, Sidis lost the lawsuit. The court had ruled that because he had once been a public figure, journalists were allowed to write about him. The decision suggested that his earlier fame meant he remained part of public interest. For Sidis, the ruling was deeply disappointing. Despite the legal setback, Sidis continued living quietly. He returned to the modest clerical jobs that allowed him to remain relatively unnoticed. Over time, Sidis's life became an example used in discussions about gifted education. Psychologists and educators debated whether extraordinary childhood talent should be encouraged differently. Some argued that Sidis's upbringing placed too much pressure on him. Others believed society had unfairly judged the choices he made as an adult. Sidis reportedly enjoyed simple routines in his daily life. Quiet walks, reading, and writing formed much of his schedule. William James Sidis died on July 17, 1944. At the time of his death, he was living quietly in Boston, Massachusetts. He had spent much of his adult life in the northeastern United States. His passing marked the end of a life that had once captured worldwide attention. Sidis was only 46 years old when he died. Considering the extraordinary promise people had predicted for him as a child, many observers reflected on how short his life had been. Yet for Sidis himself, those years had been spent largely on his own terms. The cause of Sidis's death was a cerebral hemorrhage. Cerebral hemorrhages involve bleeding in the brain that can occur suddenly and without warning. In Sidis's case, the event brought his quiet life to an abrupt end. His father, Boris Sidis, had died from a similar hemorrhage in 1923. Some observers later noted the striking similarity between the causes of death. Boris had been a powerful influence on William's early life and education. The shared medical condition added another unusual parallel between father and son. Sidis's death did not generate the same level of attention that his childhood achievements had received. Newspaper coverage was limited compared to the headlines that once celebrated him. For someone who had spent decades seeking privacy, this quiet passing might have been fitting. His life ended much more quietly than it had begun. In the decades after his death, researchers rediscovered some of Sidis's writings. These manuscripts revealed the wide range of subjects that had interested him. They showed that he had continued thinking deeply about science, history, and society throughout his life. His intellectual curiosity had never disappeared. Some of these rediscovered writings demonstrated impressive analytical thinking. Although they did not revolutionize academic fields, they reflected a creative and inquisitive mind. They also challenged the narrative that Sidis had abandoned intellectual work entirely. Instead, he had simply pursued it privately. More than a century after his birth, William James Sidis remains a mysterious figure. His early brilliance and later withdrawal continue to fascinate historians and readers. Some view his life as tragic, while others see it as a deliberate rejection of fame. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Ultimately, the story of William James Sidis is not only about extraordinary intelligence, it is also about the human desire for privacy, independence, and personal choice. Despite the expectations placed on him, Sidis chose a life that felt comfortable to him. In doing so, he left behind one of the most intriguing and debated stories in the history of child prodigies. That brings us to the end of tonight's episode. If you'd like to hear more calm explorations like this, you can follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. And a quiet thank you to the supporters who help make this show possible. If you'd like to support the show as well, you can join them through the Patreon link in the description. Until next time, sleep well.